My parents sued me, right after my grandfather, New Mexico's most renowned judge, passed away. They claimed I had manipulated the elderly to seize their assets. I didn't say a word. I simply presented the only evidence, the diary they had once torn to pieces. That day in court, the judge looked at me for a long moment and asked, "Excuse me, are you?" "Hello, my name is Nathan Miller. I'm 31 years old, currently a prosecutor for the state of New Mexico, living and working in Santa Fe where I was born and raised. If you ask me about my life story, I wouldn't know where to begin because it feels like an old book, its first pages yellowed, filled with memories I both want to hold close and let go of. But perhaps to understand who I am today, you need to know about those early days, the days I was left behind, but also loved more than I ever thought I deserved. Santa Fe is a small town, steeped in southwestern charm, with red dirt roads and adobe houses nestled under blazing golden sunlight. It's where I was born, but not where I was raised with the love of my parents. My father, Hudson Miller, was once a basketball star. Tall, strong, with a smile that could charm anyone, he was a high-earning athlete at 25, with endorsement deals and tours across the country. My mother, Lainey Miller, was a sharp, ambitious young reporter. She had golden blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a voice that could silence a room when she spoke of the stories she chased. They were a perfect couple, at least on the surface, living fast, loving passionately, and spending money like it was water. But I didn't belong to their glittering world. I was an accident, an unexpected twist they neither anticipated nor wanted to keep. According to my grandfather, when I was 1 year old, my parents showed up at my grandparents' home on the outskirts of Santa Fe, leaving me with a small bag of clothes and a vague promise to return for me soon. They never kept that promise. They left me there like one might forget an unimportant belonging. And so I became part of my grandparents' home. Judge David Miller and Willow, the kindest woman I've ever known. My grandparents' house sat at the end of a quiet road, surrounded by towering pines and a garden full of wildflowers. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was always warm, as if my grandparents' love seeped into every brick and window pane. My grandfather, David Miller, was a renowned judge in Santa Fe. Tall and lean, with silver hair and deep brown eyes that seemed to see right through you. Searching for the truth, he was a strict man, but he never made me feel afraid. Instead, he made me feel safe, as if as long as he was there, the world would never fall apart. My grandmother, Willow, was an entirely different piece of the puzzle. Petite, with a gentle smile and hands always busy, kneading dough for bread or pruning plants in the garden, she would sing old folk songs, her voice not particularly beautiful but brimming with emotion. Every time I heard her sing, it felt like being wrapped in an embrace. She taught me how to make cornbread, how to plant sunflower seeds, and how to care for others. Not just with actions, but with your heart. I grew up in that house, surrounded by evenings where my grandfather read law books under the glow of a lamp, and mornings where my grandmother dragged me to the garden to teach me how to identify each plant. My grandfather loved telling me about old cases, stories of justice and truth. He didn't share them to boast, but to make me understand that no matter how chaotic the world was, there were rules to keep it balanced. "Justice, Nathan," he once said, "isn't about winning. It's about protecting what's right." I still remember the afternoons when he taught me to play chess on an old wooden board in the living room. He always let me go first, but never let me win. "You have to learn to fight fair, Nathan," he'd say, his eyes twinkling as if challenging me. Those chess games taught me not just strategy, but patience, the importance of thinking before acting and taking responsibility for every move I made. But not everything in my childhood was sunshine and laughter. There were moments, often at night, when I lay in my small bed in my small room wondering about my parents. Where were they? What were they doing? Why did they leave me? Why didn't they want me? Those questions were like small stones quietly piling up in my heart, making me feel like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere. One evening when I was about 7, I sat with my grandfather in the living room. Outside, the Santa Fe wind whispered through the pines. I held a chess piece, turning it in my hand, and finally mustered the courage to ask the question that had haunted me for so long. "Grandpa, why aren't my parents here with me?" He paused, his hand hovering over a knight. His eyes met mine, not with pity, but with profound sincerity. He set the piece down, sighed, and said, "Nathan, in this world, some people choose to live for themselves. They chase joy, freedom, or whatever makes them feel alive. But others choose to live for others, for something greater than themselves. Your parents, they chose their own path. But you're here, and we chose you." Those words, simple yet sharp, etched themselves into my mind like a carving. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave me a way to understand it. I wasn't a child abandoned. I was a child chosen, loved, and raised by two people who devoted their lives to what was right. In the years that followed, I grew up in that house, shaped by my grandfather's lessons about justice and my grandmother's embraces. I learned how to make cornbread without burning it, how to tell when a plant needed water, and how to read the thick law books my grandfather left on the table. But above all, I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stay no matter where life takes them. I didn't know then that years later my parents would return, not to find me, but to claim what they thought they deserved. Nor did I know that in my journey to adulthood, I would face greater pain and deeper losses, but also discover the meaning of justice, not just in the courtroom, but in my own heart. 13 years had passed since I was placed in the arms of my grandparents, in their small house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, where the scent of red earth and green pines permeated every memory. I was 14, a lanky teenager with messy brown hair and eyes always fixed on my grandfather's old law books or the sunflower patches in my grandmother's garden. Santa Fe remained unchanged, with its windy roads and adobe houses glowing under the golden-orange sunlight. But within me, the world was growing larger and more complicated. My grandfather, David Miller, was still the respected judge in the region. Every morning he put on his black suit jacket, tied his tie meticulously, and stepped out of the house with a straight-backed stride, as if carrying the weight of the law itself on his shoulders. But I began to notice deeper wrinkles on his forehead, and his eyes sometimes drifted, as if lost in some distant thought. My grandmother, Willow, was as gentle as ever, but I could see she was growing tired. In the mornings when she went to the garden, she would pause to catch her breath, hand clutching her chest, her smile faint as if hiding something. I didn't dare ask, but deep down I knew time was taking something precious from her. I was a good student, not because I was exceptionally bright, but because I didn't want to disappoint my grandparents. Every good grade, every compliment from a teacher I brought home like small gifts to see the smiles on their faces. My grandfather still taught me chess, but now I was starting to win a few games. "You're learning to see further, Nathan," he said, his voice full of pride. My grandmother taught me how to make perfect cornbread, though I still forgot to add salt sometimes. "You have to be patient, Nathan," she'd say, ruffling my hair. "Everything good takes time." But then everything changed when my parents, Hudson and Lainey, started reappearing. The first time they came, I was sitting at the kitchen table working on math homework while my grandmother baked. A loud, firm knock echoed through the house. Then a familiar man's voice called out, "Dad, open the door, it's me." My grandmother whispered softly, her eyes flickering with worry, "It's Hudson." My heart raced, not with joy, but with a strange feeling as if I was about to face something I couldn't control. I ran to open the door. My parents looked momentarily surprised to see me, then quickly regained their composure as if nothing was out of the ordinary. My father stepped inside, still tall as in my hazy memories, but his once jet-black hair was now flecked with gray and his smile no longer shone. My mother walked beside him, still beautiful, but her blue eyes were colder, as if life had worn away her warmth. They hugged me, but the embrace was brief and awkward, more like a formality than affection. "You've grown so much, Nathan," my mother said, but her gaze slid past me as if I were just part of the room. They didn't stay long, My father sat down and began talking about their struggles. A failed investment, a canceled endorsement deal, a debt that needed to be paid urgently. My mother chimed in, her voice sweet but sharp, asking my grandfather for a small loan to help them get through this phase. My grandfather listened, his expression unchanging, but I saw his hand grip the edge of the table tightly. My grandmother stood behind the kitchen counter, silent, her hands trembling as she poured tea. They agreed to help, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't want me to witness an argument. In the visits that followed, my parents came more frequently. Each time the story was the same. Promises to return, half-hearted apologies, and requests for money wrapped in forced smiles. I began to realize a painful truth. They only came to me and my grandparents when they needed money. "Nathan, how are you? Do you need anything?" my father would ask, but moments later he'd turn to my grandfather, his voice lowering. "Dad, I just need this one last time." My mother would try to draw me into stories about her glamorous life, as if to make me forget the years they'd left me behind. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. One autumn night, when the Santa Fe wind blew so fiercely that the windows rattled, I overheard an argument from the living room. I had gone to bed, but my father's sharp voice jolted me awake. I tiptoed down the hallway, standing behind the slightly open wooden door, my heart pounding. My father stood in the middle of the room, his voice so loud it drowned out the wind. "You always think you're right, don't you? You think I'm not good enough, not worthy of this family?" My grandfather sat in his armchair, his voice low but firm. "Hudson, I never said you weren't worthy, but you chose your way of life, a way I can't understand. You left Nathan, your son, and now you come here, not to apologize, but to demand more." "Demand?" my father nearly shouted. "You have money, a house, everything. I'm only asking for a small share, but you'd rather cling to it than help your own son." I stood there, feeling as if my heart were being squeezed. I had never seen my grandfather like this. His shoulders trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a deeper pain. "Hudson," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "I've given you everything I had, but you didn't need me. You didn't need Nathan. You only need money." The air fell silent, suffocating. My father didn't respond. I heard his heavy footsteps, then the door slammed shut. I stood behind the door, tears streaming down my face, but I didn't dare cry out loud. For the first time, I understood that my grandfather, the man as strong as a mountain, could also feel powerless. He wasn't just hurting for my father, but because he couldn't change his son, couldn't pull him out of his cold selfishness. The next morning, I saw my grandfather sitting outside on the old wooden chair where my grandmother often sat. He stared out at the garden where the sunflowers were wilting in the cold wind. His eyes were empty, as if searching for an answer he knew would never come. I stood behind the glass door watching him and felt the loneliness of an upright man, a man who had spent his life defending what was right but couldn't protect his own heart. The days passed, and I was now 18, a tall, lanky young man with neater brown hair and a clear dream: to become a lawyer, like my grandfather. Santa Fe remained my home, with its red dirt roads and vibrant sunsets, but I had begun to see the world through the eyes of an adult. I excelled in school, topped my class, and was preparing to graduate high school, planning to pursue law. My grandfather, David Miller, was proud of me, though he rarely said it outright. Instead, he showed it through subtle nods, the way he placed his hand on my shoulder after a chess game, or the law books he quietly left on my desk. My grandmother, Willow, was still the light of our home, but that light was growing dimmer. She coughed more often, and her once nimble hands, which kneaded dough with ease, now trembled when holding a teacup. She still tried to tend to the garden each morning, but I often saw her resting on the wooden chair, gasping for breath, her smile faint as if to reassure me. "Don't worry, Nathan," she'd say, waving her hand. "I just need a little rest." My grandfather was worried too. I could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he held her hand longer when helping her up. But both of them tried to maintain a peaceful world for me, as if shielding me from the storms looming on the horizon. That storm arrived one winter evening when the Santa Fe wind howled so fiercely that the windows rattled. I was in my room studying for final exams when I heard a familiar, resolute knock at the door. It was my father, Hudson, again. His voice echoed from the living room, loud and confident, devoid of any hint of remorse. I didn't want to hear it, didn't want to see my grandfather dragged into another cycle of empty promises. But then my grandfather's voice cut through, low and sharp. "Hudson, I can't keep doing this. You have to take care of yourself." I stood quietly behind the door. My father was in the middle of the room, still tall but thinner than before, his face etched with the lines of a man who had lived too fast, too carelessly. My grandfather sat in his armchair, hands clasped tightly, his eyes not angry but pained. My grandmother stood nearby, clutching her chest, trying to intervene. "Hudson, please, no more arguing. We're family." "Family?" My father scoffed, his voice cutting like a knife. "You love the law more than your family, don't you? You'd rather sit on your judge's bench judging the world than see what your own son needs." Those words hit like a punch. My grandfather stood abruptly, his voice trembling. "Hudson, you dare say I don't love you? I gave you everything, but you chose your way of life. A life with no room for Nathan, no room for us." My grandmother stepped forward, trying to calm them, her voice frail. "Enough, both of you. Hudson, you—" But before she could finish, her face turned pale and she clutched her chest, her small frame collapsing. I rushed out from my hiding place, shouting, "Grandma, what's wrong?" My grandfather hurried to her side, catching her, his face ashen, hands shaking. "Willow, my love, stay with me," he whispered, his voice breaking with fear. My father stood frozen, his eyes glancing over my grandmother as if she were merely an obstacle. "I don't have time for this," he said coldly, then walked out. The door slammed shut, leaving a deadly silence in its wake. I knelt beside my grandmother, my hands trembling as I dialed emergency services. "Please, come quickly." "My grandma, she's not breathing," I shouted into the phone, tears streaming down my face. My grandfather held her tightly, whispering like a prayer, "Willow, don't leave me. Please, God, don't take her." I had never seen him like this. The man as strong as a mountain was now just a trembling old man, powerless against his pain. The ambulance arrived, its red lights flashing through the quiet night. The siren's wail tore through the air, mingling with the wind and the pounding of my heart. Paramedics rushed into the house, quickly placing my grandmother on a stretcher. My grandfather clutched her hand, his lips trembling as he called her name in desperation. I stood frozen, then ran after them. They wheeled her into the ambulance, and as the doors closed, the red lights swept across my grandfather's pale face. I grabbed his hand. It was cold and trembling, as if his entire world had just crumbled. At the hospital, we sat on cold metal chairs. Time dragged on, heavy and endless. My grandfather was silent, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if his soul were drifting to a place I couldn't reach. Hours later, a doctor emerged, removing his mask, his face somber. "I'm so sorry. We did everything we could," he said slowly. "She had a heart attack. We couldn't save her." I looked at my grandfather. He didn't cry, only nodded faintly, his eyes empty, as if half his soul had just left him forever. 3 days later, my grandmother's funeral was held in a small church in Santa Fe. The air was heavy with tears and whispered condolences. The townspeople came in droves, bringing flowers and stories of her kindness. But Hudson and Lainey, my parents, were nowhere to be found. I had held onto a sliver of hope that they would come, that my grandmother's death would shake them awake. I called them again, my voice nearly pleading, "Grandma's funeral is tomorrow. Please come for her." But their voicemail remained silent. An old friend of my grandfather's, Henry, a retired lawyer, stood beside me at the funeral, placing a hand on my shoulder and whispering, "They don't deserve you, Nathan. And they certainly don't deserve Willow." His words choked me, but I couldn't argue. Their absence was a final knife, severing the last thread tying me to them. I stood by my grandmother's coffin, gazing at her serene face as if she were merely sleeping. My grandfather stood beside me, silent, his eyes red-rimmed. For the first time in my life, I saw him cry. Silent tears rolled down his face, and it felt like my heart was breaking into pieces. He said nothing, only placed a hand on my shoulder, and I knew he was trying to be strong for me, as he always had. But my parents' absence in that moment made the pain even more bitter. They hadn't just abandoned me as a child, they had abandoned my grandmother, the woman who had once opened her arms to them, though they never valued her. That night, as the candles in the church flickered out, I sat alone in my room, looking out at the now empty garden. I thought of my grandmother, her smile, the way she held my hand when I was afraid. And I thought of my parents, their callousness, the way they walked away without looking back, even as my grandmother left us forever. In my heart, a silent vow took shape. I would become a defender of justice, not just to punish the guilty, but to ensure no one else would have to endure the helplessness my grandfather and I felt, wounded by the indifference of others. The morning after the funeral, I found my grandfather standing in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He said nothing, only gazed out the window where the Santa Fe sunlight bathed the pine trees. My grandfather, David Miller, the judge who once commanded respect across the region, now seemed smaller, as if my grandmother's death had drained a part of his vitality. A few weeks later, he called me into the living room, where his law books still sat neatly on the shelves. He sat down, his voice low but clear. "Nathan, I've decided to retire. A man who couldn't protect the one he loved no longer has the right to sit on the bench." His words stunned me. I wanted to protest, to tell him he was still the strongest man I knew, but his eyes, sorrowful yet resolute, silenced me. He had spent over 30 years as a judge, weighing justice with unyielding integrity. But now he chose to step away, not out of weakness, but because he felt he had failed at what mattered most, keeping my grandmother with us. From then on, he lived more quietly. He spent his days reading the old novels my grandmother had loved or tending to the flowers she had planted in the garden. But I noticed that, despite his efforts to keep the garden alive, his eyes always carried a deep sadness, as if he were searching for her shadow in every petal. I didn't know how to ease his pain, so I did the only thing I could. I stayed by his side. I washed dishes, mowed the lawn, and listened to him recount old cases, even though I'd heard them hundreds of times. I became his emotional anchor, just as he and my grandmother had once been mine. In my heart, a silent promise grew stronger. I would continue the path of justice he had walked, not only to uphold what was right, but to protect those like my grandmother, hearts vulnerable to the world's indifference. After graduating high school, I was accepted into the University of New Mexico's law school with a full scholarship. The day I received the acceptance letter, I ran home and handed it to my grandfather. He read it, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said simply, "You make me proud, Nathan." But I saw the glint of tears in his eyes, and I knew he wasn't just proud of me. He hoped I would achieve what he felt he had not. The early years of college were a grueling challenge. I wanted to be independent, refusing my grandfather's offers to help with tuition, though he insisted many times. "Nathan, I have savings," he said, but I shook my head. "I want to do this myself, Grandpa. I need to prove it to myself." So I worked while studying, waiting tables at a small diner, shelving books at the school library. Some nights I slept only 3 hours, my eyes burning from reading under dim lights. Some days I nearly buckled under the pressure, but each time I thought of my grandfather, of my grandmother, and told myself, I can't give up. My grandfather wrote me letters handwritten on pale yellow paper, his penmanship as neat as his character. He wrote about old cases, moments when he stood at the crossroads of right and wrong and the meaning of practicing law. Not to win, but to protect. "Nathan," he wrote in one letter, "justice is not a destination. It's a journey, and sometimes it will break your heart. But remember, you're not walking alone." Those letters were a flame that warmed me on the coldest days, a reminder that I was treading the path he had forged. 7 years of law school were 7 years of forging resilience. I learned to rise after every failure, to stay calm under pressure, and to believe in myself even when everything seemed against me. I grew through grief, the pain of losing my grandmother, the pain of watching my grandfather waste away, and the pain of unanswered questions about my parents. But that very grief shaped me into someone steadfast, not just in mind but in heart. The day I received my law degree, the Santa Fe sun shone brighter than ever. I stood on the stage in my cap and gown, my heart pounding as my name was called. I looked down at the audience where my grandfather sat, still tall and lean, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He wore his old black suit, but his face lit up with a smile, the first I'd seen since my grandmother's passing. As I stepped down, he hugged me, tighter than ever, and whispered, "Your grandmother would be so proud, Nathan." His eyes glistened, and I knew in that moment he saw not just me, but a piece of her, a piece of himself. After that day, I returned to Santa Fe, armed with my law degree and a burning desire to live up to the lessons my grandparents had instilled in me. I was hired as a deputy prosecutor at the district attorney's office, a job filled with pressure but brimming with purpose. Each day I walked into the office facing towering stacks of case files ranging from petty theft to complex financial fraud. I learned to stand in court, face skeptical gazes, and defend justice with the integrity my grandfather had etched into my soul. Though retired, my grandfather remained my guiding light. He no longer sat on the bench, but his wisdom and compassion were an endless source of inspiration. Every evening after grueling hours at work, I returned to the old house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, where he still lived, tending to a garden now reduced to a few solitary flowers. We sat in the living room by my grandmother's weathered chessboard, its chipped pieces still carrying the warmth of days gone by. I brought case files, reading them aloud to him, and we discussed not just the law, but ethics, fairness, and the blurry lines between right and wrong. "Being a prosecutor isn't about winning, Nathan," he said one evening as the golden lamplight cast shadows on his wrinkled face. "It's about protecting what's right, even when it breaks your heart. Sometimes you'll face tough choices, but never let your heart lose faith." I nodded, committing every word to memory, as if they were precious gems he was leaving behind for me. My colleagues at the office began to respect me, not because I was more skilled than they were, but for the calm and integrity I brought to my work. I never rushed to convict, never let emotions override reason, though some cases kept me awake at night. Once I handled a theft case involving a teenager no older than I had been years ago. He stood in court, his eyes filled with panic, and I saw a piece of myself, a boy once lost amid unanswered questions. I went home and told my grandfather, who looked at me with gentle eyes, "He doesn't just need justice, Nathan. He needs a chance. Give him what your parents never gave you." I followed his advice, recommending a lighter sentence with mandatory rehabilitation. Later, when the boy sent me a thank you letter, I knew I had done the right thing. The moments with my grandfather were the most beautiful chapters of my life. We weren't just grandfather and grandson. We were friends, a judge who had walked the path of justice and a prosecutor just beginning it. Whenever I struggled with my early cases, I turned to him. We sat late into the night over cold cups of tea and the old chessboard, talking about things grand and simple. He shared stories of his youth, how my grandmother had made him believe in love, and how he learned that justice wasn't just about laws, but the hearts of those who uphold them. But time waits for no one. My grandfather grew weaker. His dry coughs came more frequently, and sometimes he forgot the name of a book or a story he'd told before. I worried, but he only smiled. "Don't be afraid, Nathan. I'm old, but my heart is still here with you." I tried to spend more time with him, bringing stories from the courtroom, though sometimes I just wanted him to rest. But he always insisted, "Tell me, Nathan. Justice is what keeps me alive." One autumn morning, when the soft Santa Fe sunlight filtered through the window, I visited him. The house was strangely quiet. No coughs, no sound of him turning pages. I stepped into the living room and saw him sitting by the window, his head slumped forward, an open diary resting on his lap. My heart clenched. I called softly, "Grandpa?" But he didn't answer. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, as if he had finally found the peace he'd sought since my grandmother's death. I knelt beside him, tears falling silently. On the diary's final page, his trembling handwriting read, "True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it." I closed the diary, kissed his frail hand, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." I knew that from now on I would walk forward alone, but he and my grandmother would always be in my heart, in every decision, every step I took on the path of justice. In the days following my grandfather's death, Santa Fe seemed to lose its familiar light. The red dirt roads, the green pines, and even the vibrant sunsets now carried a somber hue, as if the town itself were mourning one of its greatest sons. I arranged my grandfather's funeral with all the care I could muster. The small church that had once held my grandmother's funeral opened its doors again. But this time, the air felt heavier, for I knew I had lost the last person who was truly my family. The funeral was solemn, with rows of seats filled to capacity. My grandfather's former colleagues, judges, lawyers, and court clerks, came from across New Mexico, bringing stories of his integrity and compassion. Townspeople, from market vendors to farmers he had once helped, also attended, offering flowers and heartfelt condolences. I stood there in a black suit, listening as they spoke of him, how he always listened, even to those he sentenced, and how he made people believe that justice was not just law, but a flame of truth. Yet in my heart I saw only the image of him sitting by the window, his diary open, and the sorrowful look in his eyes when he spoke of my father. Then Hudson and Laney, my parents, appeared. They walked into the church dressed impeccably, as if attending a social event. My father wore an expensive suit, his hair slicked back, but his face was cold, devoid of grief. My mother, in a long black dress and silk gloves, glanced at me as if I were a mere acquaintance. They weren't there to bid farewell to my grandfather, I knew that. They came to scope out what they might gain from his estate. I stayed silent, clenching my fists, focusing on organizing the funeral, but each time I saw them I felt the unbridgeable chasm between us. They were not my family. My family was my grandparents, the little house with its sunflower garden, the evenings by the chessboard, and the handwritten letters. 2 weeks later, I sat in the office of Arthur Briggs, a longtime friend of my grandfather. His office, located in downtown Santa Fe, had dark wooden walls and the faint scent of old books. Mr. Briggs, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, opened my grandfather's will, his voice steady and clear. My parents sat across from me, their eyes sharp as if anticipating a grand prize. I sat quietly, hands resting on my lap, trying not to let my emotions take over. Mr. Briggs began reading. All my assets, including the house, land, stocks, and savings totaling approximately $4 million, are bequeathed to my grandson, Nathan Miller. He paused, looked at me, and continued, "David left a note. I trust that only this grandson understands the value of integrity." The room grew stifling. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father muttering something under his breath. Then Mr. Briggs went on, "To my son, Hudson Miller, I leave my diary, where I recorded my thoughts and hopes." Hudson shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "A diary? He left me an old notebook?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. Mr. Briggs tried to remain calm, but I saw his hands clench. Hudson stormed to the desk, grabbed the diary, and threw it to the floor as if it were worthless. "I'll sue. I won't let this kid take everything," he roared, then grabbed my mother's arm and stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. I quietly bent down and picked up the diary. Its worn leather cover felt familiar, carrying the warmth of my grandfather in every page. I took it back to the old house, where the echoes of my grandmother's laughter and my grandfather's steady voice still lingered. That evening I sat alone in the living room under the dim glow of a lamp. I opened the diary, reading each line he had written. His thoughts on the law, the cases he had judged, and my father. He wrote of his disappointment in watching Hudson grow into a man driven by selfishness, but also of the quiet love he held for his son, even knowing Hudson might never understand. In every line I saw a father who had tried, hoped, and failed to teach his son what was right. But I also saw a grandfather who had succeeded with me, who taught me not just about justice, but about the hearts of those who believe in it. I closed the diary, tears falling silently. I understood in every line that he didn't just write about the law, but about the heart of a father who failed to teach his son what was right. I placed the diary on the shelf beside his old law books, vowing that his teachings would not be forgotten. But I never expected that, just weeks later, that diary would become the center of a storm my parents would unleash. Hudson, my father, couldn't accept the will. After storming out of Arthur Briggs' law office in a rage, he grew even more bitter. I heard from acquaintances that he went around Santa Fe telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated my grandfather, that I, a rookie prosecutor, had taken advantage of his weakened state to seize his estate. My mother, Lainey, stood behind him, egging him on with her sweet but icy voice. They hired a slick private attorney, a man with a polished appearance and eyes sharp as knives. And soon enough, a lawsuit was filed in New Mexico's civil court. Their accusation cut into me like a blade. Nathan Miller unduly influenced and exploited the weakened state of the deceased. David Miller to alter the will and unjustly claim the estate. The news spread like Santa Fe's wind. Local newspapers blared headlines, "Young prosecutor sued by own parents over estate dispute." Those bolded words tightened my chest. I never imagined I'd be the center of a lawsuit, especially one brought by my own parents. The district attorney's office where I worked had to temporarily suspend me to ensure impartiality. Colleagues looked at me with a mix of pity and curiosity, but I didn't blame them. I quietly cleared my desk, took my stacks of case files home, and braced myself for a battle I didn't want to fight. Judge Marcus Nolan was assigned to preside over the case. When I stepped into the courtroom on the first day, I saw him, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and sharp but not cold eyes. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized him. Over 20 years ago, when I was a boy, my grandfather had taken me to a courtroom where Nolan, then a young clerk, worked. I remembered him crouching down, smiling at me and saying, "Kid, if you want to do law, remember that justice is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for." Now he sat on the bench, and when our eyes met, I saw a flicker of recognition, as if he too remembered that boy from years ago. But we both remained silent, respecting the impartiality of the trial. The trial began in a tense atmosphere. My parents, backed by their lawyer, hurled harsh words. They called me an opportunist, claiming I had exploited my grandfather's affection, manipulating an elderly, frail man to seize his estate. Each word felt like a cut, but I stayed calm, emulating how my grandfather once faced accusations in court. I submitted evidence, letters my grandfather wrote to me, documents proving his mental clarity when drafting the will, and gave a concise, clear testimony. I didn't want the trial to become an emotional battle. I wanted it to be fair, as my grandfather had taught me. My grandfather's diary became the pivotal evidence. Arthur Briggs, with his warm, steady voice, stood before the court and confirmed that David had written repeatedly about his trust and disappointment in his own son. Briggs read aloud a passage. "Hudson is my son, but he chose a path I cannot follow. I place my trust in Nathan not for the sake of wealth, but because he understands that justice is the heart of those who believe in it." Those words silenced the courtroom. I looked at my father, saw him bow his head, his hands clenched, but he said nothing. Judge Nolan adjourned the trial to review the evidence. As everyone left the courtroom, I saw him linger, his gaze fixed on a photo of my grandfather on the wall, a picture of him in his judge's robe, with a stern yet warm smile. Nolan's eyes were filled with emotion, tinged with the sorrow of old memories, as if recalling the days he and my grandfather fought for justice together. I walked out of the courthouse, my heart heavy but certain that, whatever the outcome, I had done what my grandfather would have expected. The days awaiting the verdict passed slowly, as if time deliberately stretched to test my patience. Santa Fe remained vibrant with its red dirt roads and radiant sunlight, but to me everything seemed cloaked in a haze of dust. I returned to my grandparents' old house, sitting in the living room where my grandmother's chessboard still rested on the shelf and my grandfather's law books stood neatly aligned. I opened his diary, rereading the lines he wrote about my father, about love, disappointment, and a hope that never faded. Each word was a reminder that I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance, but for the values he had passed down to me. On the day the trial resumed, the courtroom was packed. Local media gathered outside, cameras flashing, and the murmur of the crowd formed an unrelenting backdrop. More Santa Fe residents showed up than I expected, some out of curiosity, some out of respect for my grandfather, and others to witness justice being served. I sat at the defendant's table, gripping the edge tightly, trying to keep my breathing steady. My parents sat across from me, Hudson's face taut with tension, Laney's eyes cold but betraying a flicker of anxiety. They were still dressed impeccably, but their elegance now seemed out of place, like a mask that no longer fit. Judge Marcus Nolan entered, his black robe swishing lightly as he took his seat. The courtroom fell silent save for the rustle of papers and a faint cough. Nolan surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on me for a moment, then he began reading the verdict. His voice was deep, clear, and carried a weight that made the room hold its breath. After thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the court dismisses the plaintiff's claims in their entirety. The will of David Miller is deemed legal and the inheritance belongs to Nathan Miller. He paused, looking directly at my parents, then said slowly, "Justice does not side with blood but with truth." A murmur rippled through the room, but I barely heard it. A cold wave washed over me as if an invisible burden had been lifted from my shoulders. My father bowed his head, his hands clenched, while my mother turned away, her lips pressed tight in a mix of disappointment and shame. I didn't feel triumph, only a creeping sadness. This wasn't what I wanted, a trial that severed me from those who gave me life. But I knew it was what my grandfather wanted. The truth had to be protected no matter the cost. As the courtroom emptied, I stood holding the diary I had carefully restored, its pages reattached, its leather cover wiped clean. I approached my father, who remained seated motionless. "Dad," I said, my voice soft but firm, "you should read this diary again. Not to apologize, but to understand why Grandpa never stopped loving you." I held out the diary, my heart pounding, unsure of how he'd react. Hudson looked at me, and for the first time his eyes held no anger or arrogance. He stayed silent for a long moment, then reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he took the diary. He said nothing, only nodded, a small gesture like a sign of surrender, not to me but to the truths he had long refused to face. My mother stood behind him, her gaze averted, but she didn't intervene. They left, their figures disappearing through the courtroom doors, leaving me with a strange sense of emptiness. I stepped out of the courthouse, the warm Santa Fe sunlight enveloping me. A gentle breeze flipped the case file in my hand, a symbol of justice restored to its rightful place. I stood there, breathing deeply, feeling the sun's warmth and a quiet peace settling in my heart. I knew somewhere my grandfather was smiling, and so was my grandmother. They had taught me that justice isn't just a verdict. It's how we live, how we choose to stand for what's right, even when our hearts ache. The lawsuit didn't just leave scars in my heart, it stirred all of Santa Fe. Local newspapers, from the Santa Fe New Mexican to smaller outlets, splashed headlines about the young prosecutor sued by his own parents over an inheritance. I was used to scrutiny, but what surprised me was how the community turned its judgmental gaze on Hudson and Laney, my parents, with disdain and contempt. At the weekend market where I bought vegetables, whispers no longer targeted me but my parents. Rosa, the flower vendor, once took my hand and said, "You're like your grandfather, Nathan. Your parents, They're a disgrace. I overheard other vendors talking, their voices filled with indignation. Hudson Miller, a basketball star, suing his own son for money? Unbelievable. Some even refused to sell to my mother when she appeared, their cold stares signaling she was no longer welcome in Santa Fe. I didn't take pleasure in hearing these words, but I couldn't deny that my parents' actions had alienated them from a community that once admired them. In coffee shops and bakeries where Santa Fe locals gathered, the lawsuit became an endless topic of conversation. Once, while waiting in line for bread, I overheard a group of elderly folks talking about Hudson. He was once the town's pride, but now, suing his own son over a few bucks. David Miller would be heartbroken. Lainey didn't escape criticism either. A local article described her as the mother who abandoned her son for fame, now returning to claim an inheritance. The words cut like knives, and I knew they weren't just talk. They reflected a town that had lost faith in those it once saw as icons. Even in the legal community where my grandfather was a towering figure, my parents were met with profound disappointment. One evening, when I visited Arthur Briggs' office to thank him for his support during the lawsuit, he sighed and said, "Nathan, this whole town knows what Hudson and Lainey did. They didn't just betray you, they betrayed David's legacy." He shared that my grandfather's old colleagues, from judges to court clerks, expressed outrage. A retired judge even said bluntly at a gathering, "Hudson Miller doesn't deserve to carry his father's name." These reactions left me conflicted. On one hand, I knew my parents had brought these consequences upon themselves. On the other, I couldn't help but feel a creeping sadness. They were the ones who gave me life, and despite the pain they caused, I didn't want to see them shunned by an entire town. I tried to focus on work to drown out the gossip, immersing myself in case files, the everyday stories of Santa Fe, where each page was a piece of human lives and fates. I handled small cases, but each carried its own weight, like the lessons my grandfather taught me. That justice isn't just about verdicts, but about restoring hope to the lost. One of my first cases after the lawsuit involved Elena, a 20-year-old accused of vandalism for smashing the glass door of an upscale boutique downtown. When I met her in the interrogation room, I didn't see a delinquent but a girl with red-rimmed eyes, disheveled hair, and a trembling voice as she spoke of being harassed by the store's owner. "I just wanted him to stop," she whispered, clutching the table's edge. I reviewed her file, examined the evidence, and realized her actions stemmed not from senseless anger but from desperation. In court, I presented the truth, emphasizing her circumstances and recommended counseling instead of punishment. When the judge agreed, Elena looked at me, tears streaming down, and said, "Thank you for believing me." In that moment, I felt my grandfather somewhere nodding in approval, as if reminding me that justice sometimes means listening and understanding. Then there were more complex cases like Maria, a single mother accused of welfare fraud. Her file revealed she used the money to buy medicine for her sick son. In court, her defense attorney argued it was an act of desperation, not greed. As I stood before the judge presenting evidence, I heard my grandfather's voice in my mind. "Justice isn't just the law, Nathan. It's the heart." I recommended a reduced sentence requiring her to repay the funds gradually. When the judge approved, Maria's grateful look stayed with me. I wasn't sure I'd done everything perfectly, but I knew I'd tried to protect what was right, as my grandfather had. Another case that kept me up at night was Jorge, an elderly street vendor accused of assaulting a customer. Jorge, nearly 70, had a weathered face and calloused hands. In court, I learned the customer had insulted and shoved him, prompting Jorge to defend himself in anger. I stood before the judge, laid out the truth, and argued for the charges to be dropped, stressing that justice must consider context. When Jorge was released, he clasped my hand, his voice trembling. "Thank you for listening to me." I smiled, but inside I felt my grandfather nodding again. These cases, though small, were how I carried on my grandfather's path. Each file was a story, each ruling a chance to uphold what's right. Colleagues began calling me David Miller's heir, not just for the inheritance, but for how I worked, calmly with integrity, always putting truth first. Yet I carried a void within. I worked to forget the pain of the lawsuit, but each time I opened my grandfather's diary, I saw Hudson, the father who threw it away, and Lainey, the mother who never looked at me with a mother's eyes. One late evening, as Santa Fe's lights dimmed, I sat in my apartment, my desk buried in papers. An open case file lay before me, but my eyes were weary, my mind drifting to memories of my grandparents. My phone suddenly rang, displaying an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, thinking it might be a wrong call, but answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse with fatigue. "Son." The voice on the other end was low, raspy, and achingly familiar. It was Hudson, my father. I sat up, my heart pounding, unsure what to expect. He continued, his voice trembling, stripped of the arrogance or anger I'd known. I read the diary again. This time I read it all. There were things I never understood, until it was too late. I stayed silent, gripping the phone tightly. I heard his breathing as if he were fighting to hold back emotion. "In every page," he said, his voice breaking, "I saw myself, a wayward son, a failed father. I saw what Dad wrote about me, his love, his disappointments. I didn't want to believe it, but he was right. I was never worthy of him." His words hit me like a cold gust. I wanted to respond, to say something, but my throat tightened. Hudson went on. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Nathan. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope for a chance to start over, even from the smallest things. I want to call you son again, if you'll let me." The air in the room felt heavier. I looked out the window, where the faint glow of streetlights illuminated the pines outside. I thought of my grandfather, his words in the diary, how he never stopped loving my father despite the heartbreak. I took a deep breath and replied, my voice soft but steady. "I don't know if I can forgive yet, but I know Grandpa would smile if he saw you trying." The call ended in silence, with only the long beep lingering. I set the phone down, feeling as if a weight had lifted from my chest. For the first time in years, I felt no hatred. Not because I had forgiven, but because I realized, as my grandfather once said, that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about giving lost hearts a chance to find their way back. I know that my journey, from a boy left behind to a prosecutor standing up for justice, is not just a story about the law, but about the heart, about choices, and about how we survive the deepest wounds. I grew up in my grandparents' home, where love was built not on blood, but on devotion. My grandfather, David Miller, taught me that justice isn't merely about determining right from wrong. It's not just about verdicts read in courtrooms or sentences that hold the guilty accountable. Justice, as he once said over our weathered chessboard, is a reminder to look within ourselves, to correct our mistakes, and to learn to love rightly. I remember the evenings he sat quietly, his sorrowful gaze fixed on my grandmother's garden, as if seeking forgiveness for things he couldn't change. From him, I learned that justice is not a destination, but a journey requiring patience and compassion. My grandmother Willow, with her gentle smile and ever-busy hands, taught me another lesson. Blood alone doesn't make a family. My parents, Hudson and Lainey, gave me life, but they were not my family. Family is those who choose to stay even when there's nothing in it for them. My grandmother stayed, though I was just a child entrusted to her. My grandfather stayed, though his heart was shattered by his son. They chose me, not for wealth or fame, but for love, a love unconditional, asking nothing in return. That love held me steady through the years of abandonment, through the painful days of losing my grandmother, then my grandfather, and facing betrayal from my own parents. Some nights I lay in bed thinking of the times Hudson and Lainey appeared, bringing empty promises and demands for money. I thought of the lawsuit, how they stood in court, accusing me like a stranger. The pain of that betrayal once made me want to turn my heart to stone, to lock away every emotion to never be hurt again. But then I remembered my grandfather, his diary, the lines he wrote about my father with a love that never faded despite the heartbreak. And I remembered my grandmother, who taught me how to plant sunflowers, how to care for fragile things, even my own heart. If one day you find yourself betrayed or forgotten, don't let your heart turn to stone. Don't let pain make you someone you don't recognize. Instead, live better than they did, not to prove anything, but because it's the fairest way to give back to life. I chose that path, not just in the courtroom, but in every decision, every action. I chose to be a prosecutor not to win, but to protect. To protect people like Elena, the desperate mother, like Carlos, the immigrant treated unjustly, like the lost hearts needing a chance to start over. The call from my father, Hudson, was a turning point. When he said he'd read the diary, that he saw himself in my grandfather's words, I realized that justice isn't just courtroom verdicts. It's the moment a father acknowledges his mistakes, the chance for a broken relationship to heal, even just a little. I don't know if I can fully forgive, but I know that by giving him a chance, I lived up to what my grandfather expected. And somewhere in the Santa Fe sunlight, I felt my grandparents smiling, proud that I hadn't let my heart harden. I stood stepping onto the small balcony of my apartment, looking down at the city sleeping below. The Santa Fe wind blew through, carrying the scent of red earth and green pines. I held my grandfather's diary, flipping to the final page where he wrote, "True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it." I smiled, knowing I would continue that path, not just for my grandparents, but for myself, for a world where justice doesn't just distinguish right from wrong, but kindles compassion and hope. 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 And hope.